She plays piano to escape loneliness, unaware it's the unfinished song of a millionaire's lost wife. Can two broken souls ever find harmony in a melody left unfinished? Sophie Carter did not yet know the answer. All she knew was the hum of her old car along the winding coastal road of New England, carrying her toward the Morgan estate, an imposing house where silence weighed heavier than the sea fog. The morning sun glinted off the massive windows of the old mansion, making Sophie squint. Perched on a rocky cliff that overlooked the gray-blue ocean, the house stood tall and imposing. Beautiful, yes, but strangely lifeless. No laughter, no warmth, no trace of a family that had once called it home. Sophie parked behind the gardens, reaching for her worn leather bag stuffed with sheet music and cleaning supplies. At 35, she divided her time between teaching piano to a handful of children in town and working part-time as a housekeeper. The dreams of a stage, of bright lights and applause, had faded years ago, the day her father passed away, leaving behind heavy debts and an emptiness she had never quite healed. Helen Brooks, the head housekeeper, was already waiting at the side entrance. The older woman, her silver hair tied neatly back, checked her watch with a frown. "You're late, Sophie. Mr. Morgan is particular about schedules." Sophie offered a small smile, trying to mask the weariness from the long drive. "Traffic on the coastal road. I'll make up for the time." But as Sophie glanced up at the tall row of windows on the upper floor, a thought struck her. In the 3 months she had worked there, she had never once seen Caleb Morgan, the reclusive, wealthy owner who seemed to live hidden from the world. Helen's voice dropped, repeating what felt like an unspoken law. "Your duties are limited to the main floor. No questions, no wandering, and under no circumstances are you to set foot in the attic." Sophie gave a nervous little laugh, trying to lighten the mood. The forbidden attic. It sounds like something straight out of a mystery novel. But Helen didn't smile. The gravity in her tone pressed down on the air, making Sophie shiver slightly. She couldn't know then that the very attic she was forbidden to enter would soon open a door to an entirely new chapter of her life. That afternoon, the sky began to shift. Heavy gray clouds gathered above the sea, and a sharp wind slid through the windows of the Morgan estate, whistling faintly in the silence. Sophie was dusting the library when she noticed a water stain spreading across the ceiling near the grand staircase. She frowned. That mark hadn't been there yesterday. If there was a leak and she failed to report it, Helen would surely hold her responsible. The house was unnervingly still. Most of the staff had already gone home early because of the storm warning. Sophie hesitated, then whispered to herself, "Just a quick look. No one has to know." She climbed the wooden staircase to the 3rd floor, a part of the house rarely used. The hallway was dim, heavy curtains thick with dust, as though leading to a world long abandoned. At the end stood a narrow door with a steep set of stairs that led up to the attic. Her hand paused on the doorknob. Helen's warning echoed in her mind, yet curiosity pressed harder than fear. She turned it gently, surprised to find the door unlocked. A musty smell rushed out as the door creaked open. The attic was vast, with faint light filtering through tiny windows, illuminating ghostly shapes of old furniture draped in sheets. The half-real, half-dreamlike space made Sophie shiver. Then her eyes caught something in the center, a large shape covered in a faded cloth, unlike the others. Slowly, Sophie approached and tugged at the corner of the fabric. Her breath caught. A grand piano emerged. Dust covered its sleek black curves, yet even under the years of neglect it gleamed faintly. Sophie's trembling hand brushed the surface, tracing the keys as though touching a memory buried deep inside her. Her father's image returned, sitting beside a battered old upright in their cramped apartment, his warm hand guiding her small fingers across the notes. The unfinished melody he used to hum while folding laundry, a tune he left her to practice, incomplete but unforgettable. She lowered herself onto the bench. The keys felt cold and unyielding, some stiff, some slightly out of place. Sophie whispered, "Just a few notes. No one will know." Her fingers pressed down. The sound was harsh, off-pitch, long out of tune. Yet to Sophie, each imperfect note was a heartbeat returning. She played her father's melody, slow and halting yet filled with memory. The attic seemed to stir awake. The tune lingered in the dusty beams of light, mingling with the first patter of rain against the glass. Sophie closed her eyes, letting grief and longing rise, as if her father still sat beside her, guiding her hands. She didn't notice the quiet footsteps approaching from the hall, didn't see the attic door creak open wider, a shadow standing motionless in the doorway. Only when the melody ended, leaving behind a silence almost too heavy to breathe, did Sophie sense it, the weight of unseen eyes. She turned sharply. The doorway was empty, yet faint footsteps retreated down the hall, swallowed by the storm. Her pulse raced. Hastily, Sophie pulled the cloth back over the piano, grabbed her things, and hurried downstairs. Outside, the storm had broken, rain lashing against the windows. But inside her chest, another storm raged, a gnawing question she couldn't shake. Had someone heard her play? While Sophie lost herself in the melody, Caleb Morgan stood motionless in the doorway. He had only intended to check the house after the storm, but the sudden sound of music drifting from the attic had pulled him there, as though by an invisible thread. The notes were harsh, clumsy on an untuned instrument, yet to Caleb, they were the most real sounds he had heard in 3 long years. Each one seemed to bore through the icy shell he had built around himself since the night he lost his wife and daughter. That piano, he knew it too well. His wife, Laura, had played it often, lulling their little girl to sleep with that same unfinished tune on rainy nights. After the accident, Caleb had draped it in cloth, locked the attic door, and sworn never to hear those keys again. And yet today the sound returned, not from the hands he longed for, but from a stranger. A sharp ache spread in his chest, painful yet threaded with something like light. Part of him wanted to retreat, to flee the room before the memories broke him open. But another part, a part he thought had died with his family, ached to feel alive again. When Sophie stopped, silence flooded the attic. Caleb stepped back, careful not to be seen. His footsteps faded into the dark hallway, drowned by the storm outside. But inside his chest, his heart thundered louder than the rain. For the first time in years, Caleb realized he had been moved, and no matter how much he might deny it, he knew he would return. The next morning, the Morgan estate felt heavy, as though the storm from the night before still lingered in its halls. Sophie arrived earlier than usual, unease gnawing at her. All night she had tossed and turned, replaying the memory of the attic, the awkward notes she had struck, the eerie sense of being watched, and the fear of discovery. Helen handed her the day's task list, saying nothing about the attic. Sophie exhaled in relief, convincing herself perhaps she had only imagined it. But by noon, while dusting the library shelves, that same familiar sensation crept back, the weight of unseen eyes. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, tall, lean, with sharp features carved by loss and time. His steel-gray eyes seemed to pierce straight into her. Dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, an impeccably tailored suit that did little to soften the tension in his shoulders. Sophie's breath caught. This was Caleb Morgan, the elusive master of the house she had never seen until now. "Mr. Morgan," she stammered, quickly lowering her gaze. He stepped forward, his voice low, roughened as though unused for too long. "Yesterday, you were in the attic." There was no denying it. Sophie swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I noticed a leak in the ceiling and I only wanted to check. I'm sorry for overstepping." Caleb's eyes never left her. "And the piano?" Heat rushed to her cheeks. I couldn't resist. It was just an unfinished melody my father used to hum. I know it was inexcusable." Her voice dropped, bracing herself for reprimand. But instead of anger, Caleb asked, "What was that song?" Startled, Sophie looked up. "It isn't really a song, just a fragment. My father never finished it. He used to say the most beautiful melodies don't have endings, only pauses, waiting for someone to continue them." Something flickered across Caleb's eyes. Pain or recognition, she couldn't tell. He turned away, his words abrupt. "Finish your work." And then he was gone, leaving Sophie standing frozen, heart pounding. She hadn't been dismissed. Instead, for a fleeting instant, she had felt something strange between them, a fragile thread neither of them had words for. The following morning, Sophie unfolded her usual list of chores. At the bottom was an unfamiliar note, written in a firm, unmistakable hand. "Attic, 14 o'clock in the afternoon. Her heart pounded. She couldn't tell if it was a command, a challenge, or an invitation. At exactly 2, Sophie stood at the attic door. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. Inside, the room was changed. The small windows had been opened, sea air drifting in, sweeping away some of the dust. At the center, the piano sat uncovered, waiting. Caleb Morgan sat by the window, tall frame still as stone, eyes fixed on the ocean. When Sophie stepped inside, he turned. His steel-gray gaze carried not only sternness, but something more fragile beneath it. "The piano needs cleaning," he said, voice rough but softer than the day before. Sophie nodded, moving closer to carefully wipe the dust from its glossy surface. Her fingers brushed lightly over the keys. Caleb watched in silence. Then after a long pause, he asked, "Why did you stop playing?" The question struck her, too personal, yet the way he looked at her made it impossible to deflect. "Life became complicated. My father passed away, the debts piled up. There wasn't space for music anymore, just work and survival." Caleb said nothing, as if her words confirmed what he already knew. Loss doesn't just take people away, it takes pieces of you with it. Then, not quite a command, not quite a plea, he spoke. "Play for me." Sophie hesitated. "I'm here to clean, not..." "Please," he interrupted, softer this time, almost a supplication. She lowered herself onto the bench, inhaled deeply, and let her fingers touch the keys. Not the unfinished tune this time, but a nocturne she had once loved. At first, her hands trembled. Then the music returned, flowing like a stream rediscovering its path. Caleb closed his eyes. The sound seeped into him, note by note, brushing the dust from his memories. For a moment, he saw Laura's smile again, heard his daughter's small applause. The ache in his chest was sharp, but mingled with it was life, a pulse he thought had been silenced forever. When the piece ended, Sophie sat frozen, afraid to look up. Silence pressed down heavy between them. Then Caleb opened his eyes, his voice low. "Tomorrow, same time." From that day on, 2 o'clock became their quiet ritual. Sophie would enter the attic, sit at the piano and play. Caleb would sit by the window, sometimes closing his eyes, sometimes watching her hands move across the keys. They rarely spoke. The music became their shared language. Sophie played pieces she remembered from long ago, songs her father had taught her, and sometimes fragments she invented on the spot. Caleb listened, sketching now and then in a notebook, the lines of buildings, designs he hadn't drawn in years. Whispers began to spread among the staff. Helen looked at Sophie with quiet concern. "Be careful, Sophie. Lines like these, they rarely end well." Sophie shook her head, trying to convince herself, "I'm only playing, nothing more." Yet deep down, she knew each afternoon, each note was weaving a bond that would be harder and harder to undo. The afternoons passed, one after another. At first, Sophie only played while Caleb sat in silence, but between the pauses of each piece, they began to speak, hesitant at first, then longer, deeper. Sophie shared pieces of her youth, about the father who raised her alone in a small apartment outside Boston, teaching her her first notes with calloused hands. He believed she would one day step onto a great stage, even urging her to apply to the Manhattan School of Music. But illness struck, and his sudden death left crushing medical debts. Sophie had to give up the scholarship, give up the piano, and bury her dream. "Since he passed," Sophie whispered, eyes lowered, "every time I touched the keys, all I could hear was emptiness. Until I found this piano." Caleb was quiet for a long time before speaking. His voice came slow, rough, as though each word weighed heavily. He spoke of Laura, his gentle wife, always full of laughter. Of his little girl, Emma, with ocean-colored eyes and a love for fairy tales. He recalled that morning, the pointless argument about work that made him leave in anger. Laura drove Emma to school. A sudden rain, a slick curve, the car slipping into the ditch. Caleb never got to apologize, never got to say goodbye. From that day, the house grew silent, as hollow as his heart. "I locked myself here," Caleb admitted. "In silence, in the sentence I passed on myself. Music. I thought it had died with them." Sophie listened, her fingers resting on the keys but not pressing them. Somehow his grief resonated with her own. She let her hand drift into a few notes. Not a song, just sounds hovering between them. Caleb turned, his weary eyes glimmering faintly. In those afternoons, music became the only language strong enough to pull them out of the dark. Sophie slowly rediscovered the voice she had lost, while Caleb began to believe that perhaps beauty hadn't been buried forever. Music had begun to open light into rooms once drowned in silence. Yet with it came a change that did not escape the sharp eyes of those who had served the estate for years. The piano sounded each afternoon, drifting down through the house. From below, the staff could hear it, whispering among themselves. "Miss Carter's in the attic with Mr. Morgan again." What began as hushed murmurs grew into curious stares. One morning, Helen pulled Sophie aside, her voice firm but tinged with worry. "I know you're a good woman, but Sophie, listen to me. Don't cross the line. Affairs like this, they never end well for someone like you." Sophie smiled faintly, trying to appear calm. "I'm only playing the piano." But inside, she knew it wasn't that simple. That afternoon, Caleb wasn't seated by the window as usual. He stood beside the piano, his hand resting on the lid, as if waiting. "Do you know Heart and Soul?" he asked, a rare softness easing his gaze. "Of course," Sophie said with a small smile, surprised. "A simple duet. Even children love it." He lowered himself onto the left side of the bench, motioning for her to sit on the right. Sophie hesitated. The closeness was startling, the warmth of his shoulder brushing hers. Caleb struck the bass chords on the left. Sophie carried the bright melody on the right. The piece was simple, almost childish, yet in the quiet attic it bloomed like a miracle. Their shoulders touched lightly, briefly, but enough to send an unfamiliar flutter through Sophie's chest. When the final notes faded, silence lingered. Caleb turned toward her, his voice low and raw, pulled from somewhere deep within. "These hours with you, they're the first time I've felt alive." Sophie froze. The words sank into her veins, sweet and perilous. She could feel what he felt, and what was rising in her own heart. But at the same time, fear surged. The distance between them was too wide. He was the master of the estate, a wealthy architect, a man of another world. She was only a housekeeper, a woman scraping by. Quietly, Sophie pulled her hands from the keys, standing as though to escape. "I should return to work. Helen is waiting in the kitchen." Caleb didn't stop her. He only watched, his eyes heavy with something Sophie dared not name. That night, Sophie sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the broken keys of her old piano. Caleb's words echoed, "The first time I felt alive." She wondered if she too had begun to live again because of him, but reason whispered coldly, "Don't be foolish, Sophie. He belongs to another world." And yet, when the clock struck 2 the next day, her feet carried her back to the attic. The afternoons in the attic continued, but the outside world was no longer silent. Whispers spread through the estate. From the kitchen to the gardens, staff murmured that Miss Carter and Mr. Morgan had crossed the line between master and servant. Helen watched Sophie with conflicted eyes. One evening, as Sophie descended from the attic, her cheeks flushed and her hands still trembling from playing, Helen stopped her. Her voice was low, almost a final warning. "Child, I've worked for wealthy families my whole life. Believe me, none of them ever truly choose someone like us. Don't let yourself be the one who pays the price." Sophie clenched her fists but said nothing. Inside, fear and longing tore at her. Then one day the fragile balance shattered. Martin Hale, Caleb's brother-in-law and the company's COO, arrived unannounced at the estate. Ambition glinted in his eyes, and they immediately fixed on Sophie as she emerged from the attic. Martin's smile was thin, his tone dripping with insinuation. "How curious. I never imagined Mr. Morgan would find new inspiration in the housekeeper." Caleb's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, placing himself between them. "Enough, Martin." But it didn't end there. Days later, Helen brought troubling news. The housekeeping agency had received an anonymous complaint. The accusation, Sophie Carter was exploiting Caleb's vulnerability, behaving inappropriately. Sophie felt the ground tilt beneath her. Everything she had built, the fragile trust, now threatened by a lie. She knew who was behind it, Martin, the man eager to undermine Caleb and seize control of the company. That night, Sophie sat at her desk, pen shaking as she wrote a resignation letter. Helen's words echoed, "Don't cross the line." Perhaps leaving was the only way to protect her dignity and to shield Caleb from scandal. She placed the letter on the piano lid in the attic, gathering her things quietly. But before she could leave, a voice came from behind. "You were going to walk away without a word?" Caleb stood there, her letter in hand, his eyes shadowed with hurt. "Sophie, I don't want you to go." She forced her voice steady. "You know this can't last. I'm only a housekeeper. And you're Caleb Morgan. Our worlds are too far apart." He stepped closer, his voice firm. "To the world, I may be Caleb Morgan. But to you, Sophie, I am only a man who lost everything and who only found life again because of your music." Sophie stood frozen. Her heart ached to believe him, yet fear held her captive. Below them, the sea wind howled through the shutters. Another storm was gathering, and this time, it would sweep them both into its center. Martin Hale wasted no time. A week after Caleb stopped Sophie's resignation, an official notice arrived like a blow. An emergency board meeting at the New York headquarters. The agenda was clear. Caleb Morgan's competence as CEO was on trial. On Monday morning, Sophie sat beside Caleb in the car as it sped toward the city. Her heart thudded, torn between fear and the sense she didn't belong. The towers of glass and steel loomed above, a world far removed from the dusty attic by the sea. The boardroom air was heavy. 12 members sat around the long polished table, their eyes on Caleb and on Sophie, whom he had brought with him. Martin stood at the head, his smile razor thin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice confident, "we must face the truth. Caleb Morgan is no longer fit to lead. He withdrew from the company for 3 years, and now he returns with vague notions, detached from our financial interests. Worse, he is being influenced by someone wholly inappropriate." His gaze cut toward Sophie. Murmurs rippled through the room. Sophie lowered her eyes, cheeks burning. Martin raised a folder. "Here is the background of Sophie Carter, a housekeeper, once suspected of stealing jewelry from the Peterson family she worked for. A police report was filed, no charges, but she was dismissed immediately. Is this the sort of person we trust our CEO to bring into company affairs, even into this very meeting?" Sophie's breath caught. The memory slammed back. Mrs. Peterson's accusation, the humiliation of packing her things in silence, the sting of shame. Whispers spread around the table. Caleb's eyes found hers, not angry, only waiting. She inhaled, rose to her feet. Her voice trembled at first, then grew firm. "Yes, I was accused, but the truth is the bracelet was taken by Mrs. Peterson's daughter. A week later, when it was found, Mrs. Peterson wrote me a letter of apology. I still have it. If you wish, I'll provide it. I have never stolen. I have never exploited anyone." Silence fell. Martin hesitated, then sneered. "An apology letter? How convenient." Before Sophie could reply, Caleb rose. His voice rang steady, resonant. "Enough. This board was not convened to judge Miss Carter's private life. We are here to determine the direction of Morgan Architecture. I brought her because she reminded me of why I built this company, to create beauty that matters." He spread plans across the table, drawings alive with warmth, far from the sterile luxury of the past. "I want this company to return to its original vision, sustainable design, rooted in community. Homes, schools, libraries, spaces everyone can enter, not only the wealthy elite. We have the chance to lead a global shift instead of being trapped in a narrow market." The murmurs shifted. A few members leaned in, intrigued. Martin cut in sharply. "Fantasy. My numbers show at least a 30% drop in profits in the first 3 years." Caleb calmly slid another set of documents forward. "This is from an independent consultancy. Short-term decline, yes, but by year 4, our market will triple. Precedent shows companies who move first have thrived. This isn't idealism, it's strategy." Silence stretched. Then an older member, once a friend of Caleb's father, tapped the table. "I support this." Nods followed. Momentum shifted. Martin's face darkened. When the vote concluded, the result was decisive. 9 in favor, 3 against. Caleb's plan was approved. Martin had lost. Caleb turned to him, voice edged with steel. One more matter. As CEO, I remove you from the COO position. You use company resources to slander and smear. That violates everything we stand for. Martin's face burned red. He shot Sophie a look of venom before storming out. In the quiet that followed, Caleb bowed his head to the board. Then, to the astonishment of all, he turned, took Sophie's hand right there at the table. I am not ashamed to stand with her. Sophie reminded me that architecture is not only stone and steel, it must have a heart. Sophie's throat tightened. In that room of power, for the first time, she did not feel small. When the boardroom door shut behind Martin, the noise dissolved. Only the late sun remained, casting its golden glow across Caleb and Sophie. They sat together later in Caleb's private office. The silence so deep Sophie could hear her own heartbeat. The long, tense day seemed to fade, leaving only a fragile stillness between them. Caleb stood by the window, watching the city gleam beneath the sunset. At last he turned. His steel-gray eyes no longer carried the distance of a CEO, only the look of a man. Sophie, he said softly, I fought hard today to keep this company. But the truth is, the thing I feared losing most wasn't it. It was you. Sophie froze. Her heart clenched, but her hands gripped her dress, afraid to believe. Mr. Morgan. Caleb stepped closer, holding out a small box. Inside was not a ring, but a silver key. The key to the estate, not as your workplace, but as our home. I don't want you here as an employee. I want you, as the woman I love, as my partner in life. His voice was low, but it trembled slightly, as though afraid of rejection. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. For so long she had told herself not to cross the line, and now he was the one erasing it. She laid her hand over the key, then looked up at him. I'll stay, but not as a housekeeper. I'll stay as your woman. In that moment, every fear dissolved. Caleb lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that began unsteady, then deepened into fire. Outside, the sunset poured through the window, bathing them both in gold. When they finally drew apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, whispering, "This is only the beginning." Through her tears, Sophie smiled. She believed him, and for the first time in years, she believed in herself too. 6 months had passed since the boardroom vote. Summer had given way to a fresh spring, and the Morgan estate no longer carried its former gloom. The attic, once a dusty chamber of shadows, had transformed into a bright music room, flooded with sunlight from wide windows. The old piano still stood at its center, but now it was surrounded by music stands, small chairs, even a violin, and a few wooden instruments Caleb had carefully chosen. No longer forbidden, the attic had become the beating heart of the house. Sophie sat at the piano, pencil in hand, finishing the final notes of the piece she and Caleb had worked on all winter. Shoreline Sonata. The music began with the unfinished melody of long ago, then grew, weaving harmonies of hope. It carried both the tenderness of memory and the strength of new beginnings. Caleb entered carrying a stack of papers, early drafts of designs for the community project the board had just approved. He set them down, walking toward her. "Finished?" he asked, pride shining in his eyes. Sophie smiled and nodded. "At last, it's no longer unfinished." They shared a quiet look, broken only by the distant murmur of the sea. But it wasn't only their music. Each Saturday afternoon, the room filled with small visitors, children from the coastal town, sons and daughters of fishermen and workers who had never touched an instrument before. Sophie guided their first notes, while Caleb spoke of how a building could sing if designed with a heart. Amid the children's laughter and hesitant melodies, Sophie often glanced at Caleb. He was no longer the man she had first met, rigid, closed off, living like a ghost. Now he sat among the children, smiling softly, his eyes alive as if rediscovering life itself. One afternoon as class ended, a shy girl asked, "Miss Sophie, what is Shoreline Sonata about?" Sophie looked to Caleb. He nodded. She bent down, smiling at the child. "It's the story of two people who thought they had lost everything, but then found each other, and music led them home." As the sun lowered, the room emptied until only Caleb and Sophie remained. They sat side by side on the bench, the new score before them. Sophie's fingers touched the keys, Caleb following with the deeper harmonies. The melody rose, whole and complete, no longer broken. The final notes lingered, and as they faded, Caleb reached across, taking Sophie's hand upon the keys. Their eyes met, holding more than words could ever hold. In the dimming light, their joined hands over the piano formed the perfect coda. And if anyone had been standing outside listening, they would have heard a completed song, played not only by the piano, but the echo of two hearts finding their way out of the dark, together. Sometimes healing begins with a melody that dares to rise in the silence.